This episode is brought to you by Global X. Since 2008, Global X ETFs has been committed to empowering investors with unexplored, intelligent solutions. Global X specializes in exchange-traded funds that offer exposure to the artificial intelligence ecosystem, including themes like data centers, robotics, semiconductors, and cloud computing. To learn more about Global X's entire suite of ETFs, from covered calls, fixed income, emerging markets, and more, visit globalxetfs.com.
What is the Deputy Prime Minister's definition of working people?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, definition of working people are the people that the Tory Party have failed for the last 14 years.
Welcome to Quiet Riot, the show that aims to educate, not escalate. I'm your co-host, Naomi Smith.
And I'm her co-host, Alex Andreou, here mainly to titillate.
Whether it's digging deep into the latest news from Westminster or drawing your attention to important issues happening elsewhere in the country and beyond, our hope is to discuss them with clever people who share our approach of calm and reasoned debate.
Let us be your tonic, your balm, your salve, as you join us in starting another Quiet Riot.
Welcome to another episode of Quiet Riot with me, Naomi, waiting in anticipation to find out whether or not my co-host has yet cast his vote for either Badenoch or Jenrick.
Which would be me, Alex. And no, Naomi, I haven't. Not yet. I am staring at the email and weighing up my options.
Lucky you, because I'm Kenny. I'm the producer, disenfranchised, but ready to chastise.
What is going on with the rhyming today?
Well, look, I was, feeling creative.
Okay.
Our Sunday School edition has led to more supporters coming on board than I think any previous show. So we start today with an enormous thank you to all our newbies for your generous support.
If you're not signed up yet, just head over to ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod, and because you're a very clever bunch, you'll figure it out.
And once you've joined, you will get details of how to join our private Discord channel, where you can meet other Quiet Rioters in evolution, not revolution.
On this week's show, we'll be getting our teeth into yet another non-scandal being treated very much by certain quarters of the media as a scandal, this time on Labour's US election interference, allegedly. But really, that's just an excuse to talk about the US election.
And because our guest is an expert on all things internal Tory, we'll be bringing you the latest from the Conservative Party's most recent attempts to coalesce around a leader in some sort of vaguely recognisable opposition-looking shape. I'm delighted to welcome back to the show commentator and broadcaster Salma Shah.
Hello.
Welcome to QRHQ, Salma. You recently had one of those milestone birthdays. Am I allowed to say which one?
You can, but it'd be funnier if people try and guess.
Okay. Are you
really offended?
Are you one of those people for whom round numbers trigger inexplicable clothes purchases, unnecessary lip fillers, perhaps even inappropriate flirtations with a young intern, or do they basically just pass you by?
So I didn't. So I turned 40 in July, and I thought, well, it's just another thing, and I had a big old party for it. But weirdly, I did feel slightly strange about turning 40, and there were a few more existential questions. I think the general younger male populace will be pleased to know that it didn't mean turning into some kind of Me Too scoundrel.
Give it time.
It's possibly slightly different for women. But yeah, so I think you do. Well, certainly for me, I think you do get a sense of proportion, perspective. I think when you get to a certain age.
I've had the crisis at the one each time.
Oh, what's 31?
I'm really quite relaxed about the 30 or 40 or whatever. And then
the next one comes.
I get to 31 and I'm like, oh no, this kind of confounds That to me feels worse.
What I hate is doing your date of birth online now. It's like playing a roulette wheel. You've got to go bring to get it all the way back.
Have you tried to see how far back it goes?
Oh, yes.
Because it's kind of like
1900
or something, and you're like, Seriously.
I did one the other day that went back as far as 1901. I was like, come on.
There might be somebody.
Come on.
Actually, on that, do you know that I read something in the Times the other day that said that the person who is going to live, the first person who's going to live until 180 is probably in their 20s right now.
Do
you think
that's interesting.
Amazing.
So that's probably me.
Not the right cue.
Well, it's not me, that's for sure.
And so it came to pass that Labour have committed another grave sin for which Sir Keir Starmer should have his head shaved, be stripped naked and marched down Whitehall while people throw over-ripe avocados, waste not, want not, and High Sparrow Jeremy Corbyn rings a bell intoning centrist, centrist, centrist. The crime on this particular occasion, some Labour campaigners going over to the US off their own bat to volunteer for the Republican campaign, which I am led to believe happens every single election. Cue a long legal letter of complaint to the Federal Election Commission on Monday, labelling the Labour Party's efforts to support Vice President Harris's election interference. Susie Wiles, co-manager of the Trump-Vance campaign, said in a statement, "In 2 weeks, Americans will once again reject the oppression of big government as we rejected it in 1776.
What we've got in this country is a British Prime Minister thinking he can wade in to American politics like he owns the place. It's his liberal way or the highway. And yes, I'm talking about Sir Keir Starmer, or Starlin you might want to call him these days, the very man whose Labour Party is meddling in US elections right in your backyard. It's not just Labour though, we've got Hollywood back in this madness too. There's an agent to Mark Ruffalo and Selena Gomez allegedly funding these campaigns by the CCHD to push censorship. So what we've got is Britain's Labour Party and Hollywood teaming up to decide American elections and what you can and cannot say or can and cannot hear on the internet.
US networks, even friendly ones, on the whole, just rolled their eyes and went, oh, look, a campaign filed legal papers against another campaign for the 400th time this year. Over here, top news item on every single channel. Why are we giving so much credence to what is basically a little bit of political trolling?
Because, as funny as that introduction
The Quiet News Day.
Because it is now a diplomatic issue, an issue of diplomatic intent, because if you look, first of all, if you choose off your own bat, if whether you're a Conservative Party member or a Labour Party member,
or indeed the leader of Reform
UK, you have your own choice about whether you want to go and volunteer. There's nothing against that. So this is not state-sponsored interference. So, I think it's sort of a bit OTT from the likes of Elon Musk and the Trump-Vance campaign to paint it as such. The problem with it is, and the reason why it's interesting UK news, is that the way that it was framed was not, these are just people themselves going off. It is, here's Labour wholeheartedly supporting the Harris campaign.
Yeah.
And that creates a headache because we're reading reports of the fact that this is a really closely run thing. We know that this is one of our, if not our most important allies in the world. And if Trump wins the next election,
re-elected,
we are going to have to work with him and his White House. And so it is not diplomatic to frame it in a way that suggests that there is some kind of institutional support for the Harris campaign. That would be really silly at this point.
I've heard that argument a lot, including on actually Politics Live, which you were on, Naomi, on Wednesday. People are saying, yes, but Trump is not just any candidate. He's quite insane and very vindictive. So we have to be really careful around him. I mean, isn't that normalizing his behavior? If both parties would have volunteers going over there and helping every single election, but on this one we're saying, oh, but you have to watch Trump because he's a nut. We're his enablers, aren't we?
I wouldn't agree with that. argument, though, because it's not about whether you prefer a candidate or he's going to react badly to something. It is just the way that you frame it. It's the idea that it was made a big deal on our side of the fact that there was a Labour institutional support for Harris. As I say, everybody's free to go and do whatever they want. Reform Party members may well be working on the Republican campaign. There may well be Conservatives who are working on the Republican campaign.
Or the Democrat campaign.
Or on the Democrat campaign, indeed. But
and in fact, I think there are, actually. There is a group.
It is not sanctioned by the government. And as we have a Labour government at this time...
But neither was this.
So I think in the way that it was presented, there were certain quotes.
Presented by whom, though?
The way that I read the story...
In Trump's legal papers.
I read the story as if it was the quotes that came out from one of the people that was going over was that this is kind of, yes, Labour and the winning team for Labour is going over to support Harris's campaign.
Right.
So I think
that's interesting.
It might be a mountain out of a molehill. I don't dispute that. But I think there is some credibility to say that perhaps was unwise in framing it in that way.
And this, of course, is part of Trump's campaign to get ahead of if he doesn't win, to say, well, it was robbed. I was robbed. Yet again, X number of reasons as to why I should have won. I really did win if it weren't for those pesky voters, those pesky interfering campaigners that came over from the UK. At Best for Britain, we're really, really strident on this with our team at election time. You take unpaid leave or you take annual leave. And not only do you do that, but if you take a photograph out with the candidate in the constituency that you're campaigning in, you say, today I find myself in Blogshire West supporting X party. I have taken my annual leave to do this. You make that part of the social media post, as I did in June and July earlier this year. So it is incredibly naive. They've now deleted the LinkedIn post that was the one that kicked that off. Up to them as to whether they think that was a wise thing to do. I suspect if you think you've done nothing wrong and you really haven't, and these are people who are unpaid or taking their own annual leave to do this, then don't delete it. Keep it up.
I know, but it's sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Damned if you do and damned if you don't.
If she had left it up, people will be going, well, it's still there. You know, she's still offering help to people to find accommodation, which is what happened. She said, basically, we've got space for another 10 people and I can organise accommodation for you, I suspect because they're linked with some bit of the Democrat Party that matches people with a spare room.
And America is very different to the UK in this respect. When we've had Americans that have come over to the UK and have, talked about, working on our campaign or other campaigns outside of election time, I should add, they've said, have you got a donor that has got a spare room? Because he said in America, they fall over themselves to say, no, I'm the guy that's hosting the campaigners that are coming. It's almost like a badge of honour to say this is how much I did for the campaign. And because of the sheer cost of housing in the UK, there aren't many people with spare rooms going that they're happy to put people up in. I imagine is part of the problem. It is, again, I think, optics over the reality of the situation. I think it was an incredibly inadvisable LinkedIn post. And really what matters, and Salma's dead right on this, it is about the diplomatic element of it now. It sort of doesn't matter whether these were permissible or impermissible donations. It's about facing a situation where if he wins, and my God, the polls are fucking tight, and it is brown trouser time for those of us that don't want him to win, it is going to make it more difficult because he is a nasty, vindictive guy, and that is the reality of the situation we find ourselves in. This is a man that is threatening 20% tariffs on UK imports, starting a trade war, horrible comments about NATO, says he'll do a deal with Putin and Ukraine to concede Ukrainian territory to Putin. I mean, this is awful stuff. And if we are less of an influence on him because of the perception that our government was batting for the other side, that will reduce Britain's influence on all of that stuff that really, really matters to us.
Yeah, I don't buy it.
I don't agree that it should have been front page, headline, all that.
That's not what I mean. I think that by elevating the story, we make it a big story. If actually the object of the exercise is, because this is diplomatically sensitive, to let the apology stand and get on with it, then that's what people would be doing. But they're not. It's just being used as yet another attack.
That is politics, though. That's why politicians quite often don't come out and sound credible, because they have to be very careful about what they say. They're constantly calibrating. And that's why there is a type of political speak. That's why Trump and Farage and people like that really cut through, because they don't speak that speak. They sound like they have a lot of integrity and they're speaking in honest terms, because it's much more simple and it's not as caveated as maybe mainstream, more centrist politicians are. And I think you have to accept the fact that in an adversarial democracy, as ours is, as the US's is, in what is essentially largely two-party systems, anything you say is going to be exploited and it's going to be used as an attack.
No, Salma.
So it's just that naivety point that I think is whether you think that's right or not.
I accept that, but that wasn't what you said originally. You didn't say it's just politics. Of course, they're going to attack them on anything they can attack them.
Yeah.
I get that. But at the same time, this is, again, like the declared donations and the gifts and all of that. It's something that up until 3 fucking months ago was a completely normal thing to be doing. And now suddenly everyone is losing their shit because Labour in particular did it, right?
Well,
because who's questioning Nigel Farage for being there?
But plenty of
Why
people,
isn't that a Why isn't that a diplomatic issue?
Plenty of people question why Nigel Farage was in the States, particularly why he was in the States rather than his own constituency, having become a parliamentarian, having spent all this time trying to become a parliamentarian instead of being in his constituency or instead of being in Parliament, being in the US.
Yeah.
I think you have to understand that now Labour is in government and it's no longer in opposition. It is a different complexion. And one is entitled to ask the question as to whether this is something that is sanctioned and understood internally to be where the Prime Minister or any of the Cabinet want their Labour resources to go. Now, they have to be very distinct about the fact that this is not about the government, this is not about Labour Party HQ, these are individuals making their own choices, which they are perfectly entitled to do. But I think it is a legitimate line of questioning for anyone, and particularly any journalist in this country, to say how much is the Labour government trying to associate itself with the Harris campaign, and is that wise on a diplomatic level?
I mean, Keir hasn't even met Harris, I don't think. No. He has met with Trump
in his last trip. I know.
Yeah, and he was right to do so.
I agree. I'm not doubting any of that. It's just that time after time, what I'm seeing is Labour Party headquarters effectively, and this was very much the feeling last night from some contacts there, being taken completely by surprise that this is a thing.
Yeah.
Like, how did this become a thing? Like, we do this every 4 years with each other, and every party does it. But suddenly, when Labour do it, it becomes a massive snafu. And there is a double standard there. There really is a double standard there. Like, inarguably, there is a double standard.
I don't think it's a double standard. I think it's a different context. And it's not solely about Trump. I think it's about the world being more difficult. I think it's about the fact that the way that we perceive Western liberal democracies is becoming much more fractured. The way we think about states and engagement with other states and other politics internationally, political parties internationally, I think all of that is fraying. So I think, yes, you're right to say something that was fine 4 years ago is no longer fine. That's not just about the Labour Party. I think there's a lot of things that are at play here that are feeding into that sense.
That's a fair point. That is a fair point. We're in a different environment to 4 years ago.
Can I just ask you guys then, given how balanced we're being about this in a very quiet, rioty way, would our reactions around the microphones here be different if, for example, 100 Republicans came over at the next election to support the Tory Party?
That's a good question.
I'm sure we'd have a view on it.
I don't doubt that for a second.
I'm sure we'd be like, oh God, Trump's people are coming over, and what does this mean for the Conservative Party, and what kind of tactics are being played? All legitimate questions. But in the same way that I don't have any issue with, Labour Party people going over and choosing themselves to help the Harris campaign, that's up to them. They are free people. They can do as they choose. They are fine to do it. But what does it mean?
But can I just say the methodology is different? And this is where I think your legitimate question actually falls over, because hundreds of American people do come here
Exactly that, yeah.
and do campaign, but they do it through some shadily funded think tank, right? Because we know that from the Atlantic Bridge onwards, actually much before, from Thatcher's years and the Heritage Foundation, there is this reciprocal give and take, money flowing across the Atlantic, right-wing think tanks and right-wing people help each other. There was a lot of Tea Party money flowing into particular Tufton Street outfits. So that's the way they do it.
And we've seen big American religious right groups funding conservative conferences in the UK in the last year.
Of course.
This stuff, you're right,
I mean,
has
we've
always
seen
happened.
Liz Truss, former Prime Minister, speaking at their conference within an election
But you
year.
have to remember that just because there is that interaction, there's lots of international organisations that are headed up by former PMs, by former cabinet ministers. And I think that's a good thing, that we are actually talking to each other and we're learning from each other, and that there is kind of a sense of international cohorts around stuff. I don't necessarily agree with everybody, but I think it's interesting to have that ideas exchange, particularly across the pond. I think you've got to make sure that what we're not conflating is the fact that exists with influence and impact, because it's not always the case that it finds necessarily an audience.
No. It's mainly learning, actually. Your learning point is, I think, the key one. I think that's why Labour activists go over there during American elections and vice versa, and Conservative activists go over there and help the Republican people, because they see how each other campaign.
Yeah.
They learn from each other. The spur is not that 100 British people can swing the fucking American election. That's ludicrous, right?
I know, it sort of made me laugh.
They're there to watch how the campaigning goes and what IT tools they use, what apps they use. It's for learning.
It's even more simple than that. If you're a political nerd and you love elections. It's like hurricane chasers. You know, there's 20
That's true.
You move where there's an election because that's your thing and you get excited about it. I mean, what sensible person would give up their free time?
That's so true.
Unpaid to go and work a phone bank.
Okay, you have to really want to love it.
I mean, all of this while, we've recently discovered that the Kremlin, through an intermediary paper company, is funding a host of far-right commentators. We did a recent episode on it. Please do go back and have a listen.
And that kind of went like that. It sort of came and went, and everyone went, oh, so all these podcasters, and they're funded directly by the Kremlin.
There is a lot of foreign interference happening in democratic events around the world.
Especially America, because there's a lot of interest.
But also last weekend, Moldova. Huge number of reports of Russian interference in their referendum and presidential elections and elsewhere. So aren't we running the risk that this just detracts from the very pernicious foreign government interference that is happening in democratic events?
I mean, Musk is dangling $1 million to people. I mean, that is fucking election interference. It's not activists going there and helping knock on doors.
I would say, as a comms professional, that if you have these headlines in the papers as we have, is that you use that as an opportunity to talk about what genuine interference looks like, the things that actually all governments, again, Western liberal democracies, have been trying to fend off. And it is this idea of what is that kind of inconspicuous infiltration of hostile state actors into our systems. And there are, bigger risks associated with this, not just around what influences people, what people are looking at, the spread of podcasting, social media, all those kinds of things that have made it much more porous in order to be able to get that kind of messaging in. But also even things like digital voting, for example, it feels like it's a really big democratizing force, but do we have enough assurance against things like cyber threats to ensure that we have good, countable, validatable results? So
I hope you're listening, Morgan. That's the way to deal with it.
But you have been to campaign on behalf of Donald Trump many times, haven't you?
That's right, but I didn't go as part of a British government. I didn't go on behalf of a political party. I wasn't paid for. I went as an individual. And, when I stood on the stage in 2016 at that big election rally, I said as a foreigner, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but I talked in general terms about Brexit, about the fact pollsters can be wrong.
So that's what Nigel Farage says happened. Here's what actually happened.
I could not possibly tell you how you should vote in this election. But... You know, I get it, I'm hearing you. But I will say this. If I was an American citizen, I wouldn't vote for Hillary Clinton if you paid me.
So Nigel Farage insists that this has Labour banked rights. He's making statements to that effect. And he was asked about his visits, and he said, I went in a personal capacity, on who paid for his flights, because his point was that if anyone is paying for the flights, that's it. And his response was, I just hopped on a friend's plane.
I mean, there are certain questions that are going to have to be asked because, of course, now that he's a parliamentarian, there's a different standard as someone in public life.
Yeah.
And perhaps he hasn't quite appreciated the difference between being what I would describe as a campaigner and being a parliamentarian, because it's just, I mean, quite frankly...
He certainly didn't when he was an MEP.
There are public figures and then there are public figures, okay? And he's made the transition from one to the other. And there are certain restrictions and certain standards that we require of people in our public life.
Right. Okay, what's your prediction for the American election? Do you have any contacts there? Are you getting any skinny?
I have a few contacts, but they're all sort of kind of like Washington policymaker side. So they're not really in the know type of Americans. I think it's more just opinion. All my friends that live out there that aren't directly engaged with politics are just in despair and keep sending me things that are timeline cleanses because they just can't cope with the stuff that's coming down the track. So, you know, everybody, and all my friends are Brits that have moved out there. So I think that that's the kind of important point because it's so alien to them, the kind of like American electioneering. But there is nothing to suggest that it's not going to be tight. And it is about a couple of 100,000 people in Pennsylvania or whatever that might be. And it's so hard. It's like catching smoke. What do they care about and what's going to shift it?
And yet, I know you have a feeling in your waters.
I think it'll be Trump.
Okay. Now, call to action. There is a kind of electoral interference that is perfectly allowed and legitimate. Money to content creators, like outfits like Aaron Rupa, Midas Touch, that clip all the speeches and put them out for people like us who don't watch everything, don't have the time to watch everything, and don't have access many times to the news networks that broadcast this stuff. I think it's an amazing service, and if you want to go and donate a little bit of money their way or subscribe to their channel or whatever,
we'll pop all of the relevant links in the show notes. Quiet, Riot. No timeline cleansing here, because it's that time of the week, yes again, when the band tune their banjos and we ask which woke flakes are stalking our totally perfect society. It is, of course, time for Wokey Dokey.
Hooray!
Wokey Dokey! Wokey Dokey!
Alex, this week, I believe it's less of a gotcha and more of a
barnstormer.
It's a conversation.
Yeah, because I am genuinely curious about this. So it's based around a piece in The Spectator entitled Board of the Rings, Wokery Takes on Tolkien.
Woken. Woken. They'll give him a new name, won't they?
And it begins with a sentence, woke is a term much overused by those on both sides of the culture war, and then goes on to apply it to everything you can possibly imagine, which I thought was quite funny. But anyway, the gist of it is Queen Latifah as the equalizer, or Kenneth Branagh as Hercule Poirot falling in love with a black jazz singer, the character played by Benedict Cumberbatch in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy being made gay in the adaptation. All of that stuff. James Bond.
Wait, so Alec Guinness wasn't gay in the original one? Sorry.
Anyway,
I've got news for you, Spectator.
So James Bond features prominently. Star Wars features prominently. Doctor Who, obviously. Dumbo, apparently, because it carries...
Dumbo's gay.
I can see why you would think that. I can see why...
Outed Dumbo.
I think he's queer curious at the minimum.
No,
anyway.
stop. Disney's
No,
to see you.
no. There's a skit in Dumbo with I think the Three Crows or something.
Yeah.
That is extremely offensive, and it hasn't been cut or anything. There's just a wordy screen at the start explaining that this was made back then, blah blah blah.
When it wasn't acceptable to call him Bumble. That's getting edited out, isn't it?
For sure. No, I might be kind. I might leave it and let our listeners round up.
Cancel Kenny. Oh my God, you cancel Kenny.
What do you think? What do the two of you think about this?
I think if you're going down this road of disliking changing the colour of the skin, the sexuality, the gender of a fictional character, then you can't be okay with white Jesus in every church in England. This was a Middle Eastern man, if he existed at all. And I don't hear this gang having too much of an objection to the often even blonde-haired figures of Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, he was hot. It was the only reason I tolerated having to go to church on occasion, because you could, as a bored teenage girl, stare at fucking good abs. They always put really good abs on him. And he's wearing a little loincloth, and he's got quite long, sexy hair, and I was quite into Anthony Kiedis at the time.
Lost about 1,000 listeners.
We've gained 2,000.
So, if this is the line that you want to take, I think you need to apply it consistently.
Thoughts?
For me, this is the thing about artistic taste. I don't think that any artistic taste should be governed by politics. Art should exist for art's sake, and that is true for literature too. I think that there is space for interpretations of things that existed in the past. I think for a lot of people, if you're looking at, I don't know, an adaptation of Jane Austen or, any of the greats that are constantly readapted all the time, Dickens, for example, which is, adapted constantly by the BBC, and everybody's always looking for new imaginative ways to try and understand the text. I think that's interesting. I quite like to watch things in their sort of original intention, because for me, it's trying to understand the context and a point of history. And I think that there's perhaps an element of nostalgia attached to it. Perhaps there's an element of understanding. Perhaps there's something about context. But I don't see this as kind of a modern interpretation versus original. I think it's really about what is your taste and what are you trying to understand from something, because...
And which audience are you trying to reach? And if it is to try and reach a new audience of younger people from, diverse backgrounds, then you have to try and help them relate to it.
I was a younger person, but still remain of a diverse background. And, I grew up pretty working class. And I loved all the classics because it was something that took me out of my life. So I also don't think that it's true that you just have to have diverse characters to engage people in those stories.
For sure.
So I think it's about really what is your intended outcome, and are you going about it in the best way? So taking your Christ example, like soft Christian rock. That's how the way that you get down with the kids.
That's hell, isn't it?
It might work for some people, but if you're not reading Dickens or Austen, is casting Idris Elba going to change that? I mean, actually, casting Idris Elba might change it.
Oh, yeah.
But the point is, what is the outcome that you're trying to reach? Is it because you think there's a new fascinating interpretation of what you're doing, and Kenneth Branagh being cast in a certain way, or having a certain scene about falling in love with a jazz singer, or when Stephen Knight did his interpretation of Great Expectations for the BBC recently, I found that absolutely shocking, because I was a bit like, oh, my God, there's kind of like an S&M scene in this. And he explained it afterwards in interviews, which I thought was interesting. And he was like, there's subtext to Dickens that we don't necessarily understand. It was a fascinating interpretation. It's not what I enjoyed. I wanted the kind of like nice buttoned up sort of Pip character and that storyline to unfold, because it challenged what I thought I was going to see.
I mean, the reason I chose this article, and it stung me a tiny bit, was because it rejected both the adaptations and the things that are as original but with a warning. And I just thought, what do you want? Do you want a young child to watch something completely unaware that those words would be unacceptable now for them to go and repeat at school? Is that genuinely what you want? Or in 1920, a famous theatre critic complained about theatres in the UK, Komijarewski he was called, using what he called chocolate box casting. And I think they still do that to a certain extent. So I dislike this sense of diversity when it's done in a painting by numbers way and there's nothing genuine or authentic behind it. And you can really spot it. You can really spot when something has been done with no other reason than to showcase diversity, or when there is an artistic reason. But they do that anyway, even in all white casts. I can't remember the last time I went and watched a Cherry Orchard where Lopakin, the former farmer, didn't have a Yorkshire accent and the maid didn't have a Cockney accent. You know,
this doesn't have to all be high art, though, does it? Because this applies as a default when works are being adapted for a different medium. And even Spielberg, when he read Peter Benchley's novel Jaws, said, look, this has got phenomenal cinematic potential, but right now I'm rooting for the shark because these guys are all so appalling.
Assholes.
Complete assholes.
Yeah,
and the whole rewriting and turning it into an anti-buddy movie was exactly the sort of stuff we're talking about.
Yeah, so authenticity is basically, that's the key. And I can sense it, like I said, when I'm being manipulated by a casting process.
Yeah.
But I can also sense it when people object to stuff and I read through the piece and I think, really what you're saying is that you don't like seeing black and brown people on telly. People have always adapted stuff that they've liked into their chosen.
And not EastEnders. I mean, I haven't watched it for a couple of decades, but even 20 years ago, the East End was not as white as the cast of EastEnders still was, with one token Asian family and maybe one black character if you were lucky.
Oh, God, I always wanted to be the token Asian.
I know, though. What a moment that was, though, right? What a moment that was. And when there was a gay Asian, it was like, yeah, wasn't there? There was a big storyline.
I don't remember.
Yeah.
I do remember the Asian that ran the corner shop on Curry.
There was a character that had a gay affair, because I remember
Listeners?
it being a really big thing. Yeah,
get on the Discord channel, tell us.
Do write in, tell us
who is right. Now it is time for Badrick. Genrock. What is the correct portmanteau for the Tory leadership election? The polls have opened. Voting has begun.
Badrock?
Baldrick.
And there will be no more TV debates. Is it Alien versus Predator? No matter who wins, we all lose. On a scale of 98 to 100, how dangerous would either be for our future in the ECHR? I jest. I'm sure it will all be fine. Salma, there is a lot to ask you about, and you're closer to it than we are, but don't worry, we don't expect you to have all the answers on all of it. This week we saw former Conservative Minister, self-styled One Nation Conservative David Gauke, join the government's review of the prison service. Do you think that where the Conservative Party has landed now between Jenrick and Badenoch as the two front runners, that more One Nation Conservatives might migrate away from the party?
I think lots of One Nation Conservatives are thinking, or centrist Conservatives, the same ones that supported Cameron and elected Cameron, a lot of those people are still in the party and still activists. I think they are looking at this and hoping that there'll be some growing of the party psyche generally, and then in 5 years' time, there might be a different selection that they could potentially make for leader. I mean, I should probably declare, I have voted, I have put in my postal vote, and I have voted for Kemi Badenoch, largely because I think she is the better of the two options, because if she is willing to listen over the course of the next 5 years, that perhaps she could round her offer into something that is credible. and perhaps bring more people along with her. You've seen a huge spate of Tory grandees saying that they're going to support her and go forward. But I think that the difficulty is that in the same way that previously the left had this identity crisis, the right is also having its identity crisis. We're all having a big old identity crisis. Because what we understand by left and right and what we've understood about it for the last 40 years is no longer true.
No.
And you see that in America. And you see things within the Conservative Party. I mean, if I take it as an example, there are revolutionary elements to it that I do not recognize as a centrist conservative. My worldview is that you keep the status quo until you understand why you need to change it, until there's an absolute imperative to change it. And even then you do so in an evolutionary, incremental fashion. So the Liz Truss popcons, for example, or the Trumpist view.
Tear it all up and start again.
It's not... It is not where my sort of conservatism is. Mine is incremental.
It's almost antithetical to know. I was going to say the same thing.
It is incredibly unconservative. And this is, see, even Mrs. Thatcher was a radical because she was all about digging out those vested interests. But she did it in a way that had a big economic framework to it that she was able to communicate. Now, like her or loathe her, in the same way that Tories look admiringly at Tony Blair, there was a shift, and both those leaders were exceptional because they recognized and they felt the shift that was in the ether and they responded to it with great intellectual depth and great communication. And that's, I mean, why am I framing it in this way in relation to this leadership contest? Is because we know what's missing, we know what's lacking, but you can only have what you have. And so we are looking at this and wondering, how do you build something and coalesce around a candidate that might be able to get you part of the way there, if not all of the way there?
And she is basically setting out her stall as, I'm prepared to listen. Now is not the time for me to top down to the party, set out what I think all of our policies should be on absolutely everything. I'm curious to ask you, though, about where you think the pressure's coming from. I think there was a poll of Conservative councillors, 50% of whom think neither Jenrick nor Badenoch will be leader at the next election. There's been talk about that over the last few weeks that, whoever it'll be, there'll be some kind of Ian Duncan Smith candidate interim until the next election. In order to be politically electable at 2029, whenever the next election is, I mean, look, we're 100 days in to the current government. That is a third of the way through a year. In 5 years, you only have 15 thirds, and we've already done one of them. These things come around quite quickly.
Yeah.
What is your take on that? I mean, can the Tory party turn it around in that time? Because it isn't a huge amount of time with her as leader.
I'm going to give you a really boring technocratic answer because it is the best answer in my view, which is you can only turn things around if you set your priorities correctly. And that is, what is the strategy that I'm aiming to achieve? Who are the people that I need around me? Or at least not the particular people, but what are the kinds of skills that I need around me in order to achieve that? And what am I willing to give up? And what are the absolutes that I have to have in place in order to get there? They sound really obvious things, but it really takes somebody with great managerial skills, but also great visionary skills to do those things together, because you have to take a lot of flack. You will have to keep your momentum going no matter what is happening outside in the rest of the world. And you need a real kind of strength of character to be able to follow that through. Whether they survive or not to the end of the parliament is going to be dependent on what's happening in the Labour Party. It's going to be dependent on what's happening in the country. It's going to be dependent on whether the next leader can land enough blows to look like there is some momentum behind them.
And how they grow into the
role, right?
And which electoral strategy they go for. Much of the talk around the campaign has been, from both candidates, has been really rather appealing to the Reform voter, if not actual Reform Party members.
Who
is that right,
the
though?
voter that Luke Trill says is the least
likely to
be
Reform
won back this
won back
parliament,
over.
incidentally.
So
he's done a lot of work, and he found that people who have switched from Tory to Reform are maybe they're like 3 times less likely to vote Conservative again in this electoral cycle.
So I guess the question is, do we hope that they will be only doing all of this stuff to try and win over the party faithful, who are the electorate in front of them at the moment, and will then pivot to a more centrist approach to conservatism in order to win over a larger cohort of the electorate? Or is it, under a first-past-the-post system, all we really need to do is try and squeeze away some of those lost reform voters that previously voted Conservative?
I think you can't have an electoral strategy until you start seeing the way the demographics are shifting. And actually, the next budget is going to tell you really what people think about the current government and where that tone is going to go. I think, obviously, you are going to speak to your selectorate whilst you only have them as your grouping that you need to speak to. I think it's very hard to do a pivot when you promise one thing and do something else. There is a distinction between the two candidates in that Kemi is not interested in speaking to reform, but Jenrick is talking about subsuming reform because he's allegedly the candidate that Nigel Farage is most frightened of. So there is a distinction between them in the way that they could pivot. The reality is, though, unless you're winning the reform voters, at some point, you are not forming a government. Right? Labour is going to face this as well because Farage already has his guns trained on Labour seats. And he's clocked early, right from that election result in July, that actually he is now fighting with Labour, where they pushed us into third place in order to...
In about 90 seats.
The point is, there is no need to have an electoral strategy at this point. It will develop. And it is still actually largely unclear as to where people are going to go. And that will be impacted by what's happening in our current state of affairs.
And a lot of the votes went to the Liberal Democrats at the last election.
So let me put it this way. In 2019, Boris Johnson, again, like him or loathe him, did an amazing thing where he stretched and pushed out the Overton window beyond its natural conventions. And we always knew that elastic would snap at some point. And it snapped at the last election because you lost what you had down in your kind of like southern core hold, and you lost what you had in terms of your new seats. Actually, it's not new. It happened in 87 as well, when Mrs. Thatcher drew out the lines and pushed that window out then at that point. And the same thing happened. It snapped back. The question for us is not how do we build that electoral coalition again? It's how do we speak to the issues that are occurring now? You can't just play politics without any substance. There's got to be intellectual substance.
If this was a general election, yes, it would be wrong to be standing with no policies. This is not a general election. And if you're going to solve a problem, you need to make sure that you know what the question you're being asked is. He thinks the question that is being asked is, what are the right policies to win a general election? I think the question being asked is, why should we trust the Conservative Party? Trust is an issue. So we have two different diagnoses, and he is writing a new manifesto. And if that's what members want, someone who's got more promises to make, that's fine.
You said it's their time to have an identity crisis. We were discussing a really interesting piece on Sunday. And what they were saying was that that's precisely what the Conservative Party is not doing with this leadership election. There are no debates. These two people won't have debated each other directly, not once, actually, throughout this thing. Badenoch says this is not the time for policy. Jenrick says to have no policies is disrespectful to the membership. And they're not having that identity crisis. They're having an election of leader based on whether they want someone who looks and speaks conventionally versus someone a little bit more raucous who can sort of upset things. But I've seen nothing about what does the modern Conservative Party for the 21st century look like?
Yeah.
Where do they go in terms of economic policy? What do they do on housing?
But that's politics all over. I mean, I would argue and say that the Labour Party's done the exact same thing.
Oh, I agree.
Yes. So let me say that actually the reason that you're not seeing that substantive conversation is because nobody is having it. It's not just about...
Well, that's quite depressing, isn't it?
Of course it is. But this is entirely why we're trying to surface this kind of discussion. I speak to so many people outside of, what's happening in Westminster who are thinking about the future of conservatism, who are thinking about the future of politics, who are thinking about the big mega trends that are occurring in the world in terms of conflict or climate change or any of those big things. The depressing thing about it is that intelligence, that conversation is not being harnessed by people in Westminster. And when I mean that, I mean sort of people who are competing for power. it is not a lack of other people thinking about it. It's because they are out of tune and out of step with what's happening. And that is really the difficulty in politics at the moment.
Yeah.
I've got a rumour mill question for you, please, Salma. I'm not asking you to speculate on whether rumours are true that Rishi Sunak is only holding on until a new leader is appointed before resigning his seat of Richmond in North Yorkshire to go off to play the game that, assuming that these rumours are true, and he does do that, who do you think might try to make a comeback? Boris Johnson, Penny Mordaunt, somebody else? That will be the first by-election, if it happens, of this new parliament, and one that the Conservatives would almost certainly win.
I think that would be such a hotly contested seat, not only for those people who went at the last election to the Penny Mordaunts, maybe Boris Johnson, but I don't know, if that comeback kid, he may well come back, but whether he'll have the same success or not, his trajectory isn't up, it's down. Penny Mordaunt is not a bad shout, but there are those people, I think, who are sort of waiting in the wings, who maybe lost out last time. I'm thinking kind of like the Rupert Harrisons of the world that used to be a bag carrier like me, much more significant. Seb Payne, potentially. But there's a new generation that's also waiting in the wings. So I think if Rishi Sunak does step down and that amazing gem of a Tory seat comes up, there will be a lot of people, but who gets that selection, who wins that selection, if it does occur, is going to be really totemic about the future of the Conservatives. Are we looking back or are we looking forwards?
I agree. And I
maybe
think
it'll be Seb Payne's
finally.
Maybe this time.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll throw my hat in the ring.
Maybe
yes, Salma, go on.
Maybe you should.
Maybe you should, now that you're a member.
Salva, do you want an action point? I left it for you. Is there a sort of one nation supporting mechanism, organization, society that you want centre-right people listening to the podcast to join in order to try and anchor the Conservative Party in that direction?
Look, so there's always the Tory Reform Group, the TRG, that has always been the kind of like centrist bit of the Conservative Party. But actually, to me, as tired as a cliche as this is, I would say to anybody who's a centrist conservative like me, just join the party. Just join, take a statement. And, when you vote for the leader, you also have skin in the game. And that means that your opinion is valid when you decide that you want to be critical or you want the party to move in a different direction.
Quiet, riot. No, snowdrops and daffodils, butterflies and bees.
What is this?
Sailboats and fishermen. Oh, wait, now this is beginning to go in a different direction for me. I was surprised at that lyric. Anyway, you get the gist. It is time to pick a story from the positive side of the ledger. It's time for Grin and Share It.
Good news is welcome to me. Bad news is hell come to me. Good news. Do-de-o-do-lo, 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 I want good news.
Naomi, what's today's fuzzy, warm feeling?
Well, warm. New advancements in solar, which is great. Now, I never thought solar would become cheap enough to be a very viable alternative renewable energy in my lifetime, but it really has. I mean, the cost of solar has come right down. And now, through the use of, let me get this correct, perovskite crystals, aka calcium titanium oxide, rather than silicone. So the perovskite crystals seem to be riding to the rescue to save the day, because while silicon is calculated at giving us an efficiency of about 29%, the perovskite crystals can deliver efficiency rates well over 30%, actually thought to be around 43%. So really a very major advancement for us in terms of this form of renewable energy. So
because they make I think I read about this, they're basically much more efficient at storing it, right?
Exactly. And storage is the big issue when it comes to all energy. It's all about how you store it.
That really is a good news story. Quiet.
And very sadly, that is all we have time for. Salma, thank you very much for coming back on Quiet Riot.
Pleasure.
Listeners, she brought cake with her. So if you see an uptick in the number of appearances from Salma, it's because she's literally bought us off with cake. Thank you so much.
Freebies.
Yeah. Mine was called Golden Gate Time. Yes, like the Australian ice cream, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's an Australian ice cream.
Yeah, it wasn't a comment on your life choices.
I mean, feel free should you wish.
He should be so lucky.
Listeners, thank you for turning up again. We'll be back with more very, very soon, including several discussions on topics specifically requested by our backers on the Discord channel and our social media channels.
So if you do have a burning desire for us to cover something, sign up on Ko-Fi, get onto the Discord channel and leave us your ideas.
But if your budget is tight, you can still do us a solid by leaving us a review, sharing your favourite episode with a friend and following us on socials. We have a couple of cracking episodes in the next 2 weeks to cover the budget and the US election result. You will not believe our panels. That's it for now. See you next time.
Bye. Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreu and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.
Quiet Riot.
Salma, you are an absolute legend.
You're
so much better.
What cake does to you.
Cake makes everything better.
It does.
Doesn't it?
In moderation. We have to save the NHS, remember?
Oh, first things first. More cake.
Yeah.